लाइट यो चाहिँ है गाइस यस्तो
ल नदी लान्छ भनेर फोन हान्न फोन मेरो बिहान सिट्यो भने पैसा छैन सिट्यो
Across the mountain border between Nepal and Tibet, the Lhende Khola flash flood has already killed at least 95 people, with some official counts climbing above 160 as bodies are recovered in districts far downstream from where the water started.
लाइट यो चाहिँ है गाइस यस्तो लाइट यो पुरै ड्याम फुटेर आको
And more than 400 travelers, hydropower workers, and traders are still unaccounted for tonight. 341 of them foreign nationals who came here for the trekking and pilgrimage season. The road to the Chinese border is gone. Rescue helicopters are being turned back by cloud and rising water. Banks, customs posts, and health clinics are barely standing. Here's the important part. The debris that started all of this may still be holding water back high in the mountains, and authorities on both sides of the border are warning that a second surge could come down the same valley with almost no notice in a week when the monsoon is expected to strengthen rather than fade. Cryosphere scientists now describe the Lhende Khola event as the defining mountain disaster of August 2026. It began high above the Nepal Tibet border at around 9 in the morning local time on August 26th, when a mass of ice and rock broke away from a glacier and fell into the Lhende Khola, a tributary about 20 kilometers upstream of the Maiteri Bridge. Seismic instruments picked the collapse up as a tremor, and for hours it was reported as an earthquake. Analysts at the United States Geological Survey later concluded the signal was not tectonic at all. It was a mountain coming apart. According to preliminary analyses shared by Chinese and Nepali agencies, the debris did not simply wash downstream, it blocked the river. The water stacked up behind that plug of ice and rock like water behind a dam, filled a temporary lake, and then broke through. What came out was not a rising river, it was a moving wall. From the high valleys of Gyirong County in Tibet and down through the border post at Rasuwagadhi, across the Lhende Khola, through Timure and Shafrubesi, and all the way into the Trishuli Valley and into the lowland districts of Nuakat and Dading, that surge held its shape for more than 100 kilometers. At Maleku, far down the Trishuli, the gauge still climbed about 7 meters, more than 20 feet in half an hour. At its peak, the water was moving through valleys that hold tens of thousands of people, along the single road that carries almost all of Nepal's overland trade with China. Satellite images shared by Chinese authorities and reviewed by the International Center for Integrated Mountain Development in Kathmandu show the icefall, the scar of the landslide, and the short-lived lake it created. Where a village of shops, guest houses, and customs sheds stood in the earlier image, the later one shows pale gray gravel and open water. On the Trishuli at Glacier and Dading, the river rose about 9 meters, close to 30 feet in 30 minutes, a rate that gave the settlements below almost no time to move. In Rasuwa district, 40 kilometers of paved road, about 25 miles, were stripped out of the valley, and 19 motorable bridges went with them, cutting an entire district off from the country in a single morning. At Rasuwagadhi, goods worth about 45 billion rupees passed through the customs yard last fiscal year at a crossing that had only reopened this year after being shut nearly 6 months by the flood of July 8, 2025. And across the national grid, 431 megawatts went offline at once, close to 13% of everything Nepal can produce, which utility officials call the worst single blow the network has taken in years, turning an ordinary monsoon evening into a nationwide supply emergency. But the numbers only start to mean something when you look at where they landed and at how little time anyone in that valley had. In the days before the collapse, nothing in the forecast pointed at this. Nepal's Department of Hydrology and Meteorology had issued the usual monsoon advisories for the Central Hills, the kind that go out most weeks between June and September. Rasuwagadhi had reopened for trade earlier in the year after nearly 6 months closed, and traders were racing to clear a backlog of Chinese imports before the festival season. Trekkers were moving up the Langtang route. Indian pilgrims were passing through toward Mount Kailash. On the night of August 25th, the customs yard, the market, the guest houses, and the workers' quarters at 3 hydropower sites were all full. The first minutes belonged to the border itself, where the surge came down the Lhende Khola and hit the crossing at Rasuwagadhi before any warning could travel ahead of it. The newly built bridge went, the customs area went, the market went. Chief Customs Officer Rajendra Dungana later said the flood had left virtually nothing on the Nepal side. 15 customs officers who were at their desks that morning are still missing. Then it reached the powerhouses. Rasuwagadhi, Chilime, and Upper Trishuli 3A all sit at river level, which is what makes them efficient and what made them impossible to defend. Bridges buckled, transmission structures folded, and generating units went dark within minutes of each other, pushing 431 megawatts off the national grid, according to the Nepal Electricity Authority. The 220 kilovolt substation at the Trishuli 3B hub was damaged as well. Downstream, the Trishuli and Davigad stations were hit next. 196 hydropower workers are unaccounted for, 92 of them at the Rasuwagadhi site alone. By the middle of the day, the wave was in the lowlands. The Trishuli at Glacier and Maleku rose faster than anything the gauges there had recorded in recent years, and the Department of Hydrology and Meteorology named Rasuwa, Nuwakot, Dading, and Chitwan as the districts most at risk, with the confluence of the Trishuli and the Marsyandi near Mugling flagged as the most dangerous point. By evening, bodies were being recovered not only in Rasuwa, but in Nuwakot, Dading, Gorkha, Chitwan, Tanahun, and Nawalpur, some of them more than 100 kilometers from where the people had last been seen. That distance is the clearest measure of how fast the water was moving. When you look at the human toll of the Botekoshi flood, the numbers do not line up neatly. Different agencies and newsrooms are counting in different ways and on different timelines. Nepal's own tally, built from bodies actually recovered, stood at around 95 by Wednesday evening, spread across those 6 districts. International wire services and broadcasters, which add the Tibetan side of the border to the Nepali figure, were reporting at least 160 by Thursday, with 157 bodies described as recovered. And a third count kept by the district administration in Rasuwa tracks the missing rather than the dead. 403 travelers, 62 of them Nepali, and 341 foreign, including 133 Indian nationals, 47 Americans, 34 Australians, 33 Britons, and 24 Canadians. Officials have said repeatedly that these lists overlap and that other names have not been entered at all. Behind those numbers are the same few situations, repeating from one settlement to the next. At Rasuwagadhi, people were swept from the customs yard and the market where they worked, in the open, in daylight, with nowhere uphill to go. At the 3 hydropower sites, crews were at river level inside powerhouses and intake structures when the surge arrived, which is why the missing list from those sites alone runs to nearly 200. In the lodges at Timur and Saifrabesi, trekkers and pilgrims were in buildings that stood on the riverbank because that is where the trail runs. Along the Trishuli, families had between no warning and a few minutes because the water rose 9 meters in half an hour and there was no upstream gauge left to send a signal. And in the days since, people who were injured or stranded have not been able to reach a hospital because 19 bridges and 40 kilometers of road are simply not there. Everyone agrees on one point. This was not a flood that people watched rise and then walked away from. It was a single mass of water, ice, and rock that arrived in one push, and in most of that valley, it did not give anyone a second chance. Inside Nepal's energy transition, another quieter emergency is building. The same flood that destroyed the customs yard and knocked out 431 megawatts of hydropower also swept away the country's main gateway for imported electric vehicles. More than 500 vehicles were sitting at Rasuwagadhi awaiting clearance, many of them Chinese electric cars from brands like BYD, MG, and Wuling, some booked for auto shows in Kathmandu. Nepal has spent years building a case that its rivers can charge its cars. In one morning, the same river took out both the charging capacity and the cars. For the importers who finance those shipments on credit, it is a statistic with very real balance sheets behind it. There is the visible damage, the bridges, the powerhouses, the gravel where a market used to be. And then there is the slower, less visible damage. 9 bank branches gone, in a district where those were the only place to draw cash. Trekking bookings canceled for a season that pays for the rest of the year. Families who cannot prove what they owned because the office that held the paperwork is downstream. Here is the important part. While rescue teams are still working the riverbed for the missing, the thing that caused this may not be finished. Scientists at the International Center for Integrated Mountain Development have warned that debris from the avalanche may still be impounding water upstream, and that a second release from that blockage would come down the same valley, into the same communities, with the same lack of warning. Chinese authorities have begun draining the blocked section of the Gyirong River for exactly that reason. Evacuation orders at Gyirong port remain in place. The timing could hardly be worse. Nepal's Department of Hydrology and Meteorology has advised that monsoon activity is likely to increase over the next 3 days, with heavy rain expected across several provinces. The valley walls above the Botakoshi have just been scoured bare, which is the condition under which ordinary monsoon rain produces extraordinary landslides. The slopes are stripped. The channel is choked with new debris. The gauges and the bridges that would have measured and carried a warning are gone. A second surge on top of that could trigger fresh landslides, cut the few remaining access routes, and strand rescue crews in the same places they are trying to reach, just as families are beginning to return to look for what is left. For settlements that depend on that single road to the border, a closure cuts off not just traffic, but fuel, food, and medical supplies. Here is the detail that changes the picture. The threat did not stop at the Nepali border. As the surge moved into the Narayani and toward the Gandak, India put 20 rescue teams on alert, 9 in Bihar and 11 in Uttar Pradesh, with units deployed to West Champaran, Muzaffarpur, and Kushinagar. Close to 5,000 people were moved in Bihar as a precaution. A glacier that fell in Tibet was, within a day, a reason for evacuations 3 countries wide. Across the districts hit hardest, the response is now in a long, grinding recovery phase. The Nepal Electric Authority has confirmed damage to 6 major facilities: Rasuwagadhi, Chilime, Upper Trishuli 3A, the Upper Trishuli 3B hub substation, the Trishuli station, and Devigat, and has asked consumers to be patient. 431 megawatts is not a number that comes back in days, and the 220 kilovolt substation is the harder problem, because until it is repaired, even undamaged plants upstream have no reliable way to deliver power to the grid. On the trade side, the picture is worse than a normal closure. Rasuwagadhi handles the overwhelming majority of Nepal's overland commerce with China, about 45 billion rupees of imports and just under 900 million rupees of exports last fiscal year. Officials have not been able to safely enter the customs area to count what was destroyed, which means the loss cannot yet be documented, which means importers cannot yet claim against it. This is the second time in 14 months that a flood from the same river system has taken this crossing out. In transport, 19 bridges and roughly 40 kilometers of blacktop are gone from a district with no alternative route. Everything that reaches Rasua now reaches it by air. The Nepali army and police have been searching the riverbed since Wednesday morning, and 114 people have been evacuated by helicopters so far, in weather that has repeatedly grounded flights. On the humanitarian side, India has sent 10 tons of relief supplies and medicines for Rasua, and Nepal's government has instructed local authorities to move residents in low-lying areas to higher ground. Emergency managers say the next several days will decide whether this becomes a recovery or a second disaster. In the weeks and months ahead, the Botakoshi flood is likely to be remembered as more than another monsoon disaster. Forecasters, emergency managers, and policymakers are already filing it under the label historic because of the way it combined a high mountain ice collapse, a temporary landslide dam, a cross-border river, and a national power system, all in the space of a single morning. It exposed weak points that engineers have warned about for years: run-of-river hydropower plants built at river level, in narrow Himalayan valleys with no realistic defense against a surge of this size, a trade corridor with exactly one road and one bridge, monitoring networks that watch rainfall carefully but watch high-altitude ice hardly at all, which is why the first signal of this event came from a seismometer rather than a flood warning system. At the same time, scientists and climate analysts are careful with their language. No single flood can be blamed entirely on climate change, and researchers investigating this one have said openly that it could take days simply to confirm what happened. But it fits a pattern that specialists in the region say is becoming more familiar. Warming is thinning the ice and thawing the frozen ground that holds high mountain slopes together. That means when ice, rock, and meltwater do come loose, the result can be larger avalanches, more temporary lakes forming behind debris, and more sudden releases arriving in valleys with no warning system tuned to detect them. The Botakoshi flood is also prompting questions about investment. How much should be spent to monitor glacial lakes and unstable ice in terrain where almost nobody lives? How to build hydropower, border crossings, and roads in valleys where the only flat ground is the ground the river wants back? How to improve warning systems so that communities understand not just that a flood is possible, but how many minutes they would actually have. And just as important, how to protect the workers, traders, and villagers who live at river level, because that is where the work is, and who have the fewest resources to move anywhere else. In the end, the story of the Botakoshi flood is not just a list of numbers. It's a reminder of how quickly normal life can break down when high mountain ice, a blocked river, and a valley full of people all line up in the same place. A single morning managed to erase a border town, take 13% of a country's electricity off the grid, cut an entire district off the road network, and leave a missing list spanning a dozen nationalities that will take a long time to resolve. For the families waiting in Rasua tonight, this will be remembered not as a headline about a glacier, but as the morning the river came up 9 meters and did not give the valley half an hour. They're waiting for two things that have not come back: a road and a name on a list.